Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my ongoing experiences as a teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. I've been involved in a couple of interesting training sessions recently, and I thought that today I would share with you some of the things I thought about during those sessions. And some of these thoughts are not very well formed at the moment. Maybe by the end of this recording they'll be a little bit more developed. I don't know, we'll find out. Or I might be more confused by the end. We'll see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to start with the final session of my SSAT Leaders for the Future course, which I've been doing this year. It's been a good course, and in particular, the last session was quite thought-provoking. So the session was entitled Leading Yourself in the Long Term. And one of the main objectives of the session is to think about good time management. And within the section on good time management, something came up called the Pareto principle. And I've heard of this principle before in various contexts. I think I've heard it spoken mostly about in economic contexts, and that's the origin of this principle, in fact. So let me read you what came up on the slide when we were talking about this Pareto principle thing. Originally, the Pareto principle referred to the observation that 80% of Italy's wealth belonged to only 20% of the population. I've done some research since the training session, and apparently that distribution pretty much holds in every other country as well. So it's not just Italy. More generally, the Pareto principle is the observation that most things in life are not distributed evenly. It can be taken to mean a number of practical things. The idea here being that 80% of the consequences are often the result of only 20% of the causes, if that makes sense. So if you're trying to achieve something and a perfect outcome, let's say, is represented by 100%, whatever it is you're trying to achieve, you achieve 100% perfect outcome. And you do various things to try and make sure this perfect outcome happens. The Pareto principle states that all the things that you do to try and ensure that you get this perfect 100% outcome, only 20% of those things, 20% of your efforts, 20% of the things you do will actually result in 80% of your perfect outcome. So that's the Pareto principle. And like I said, it came up in this SSAT session on learning to lead oneself, and in particular this section on time management. And so I've been thinking really about how it's meant to apply to time management. And I mean, as you know, I've got a very keen and ongoing interest in workload management. As we've discussed at length in previous episodes, workload is the teacher killer. So anything we can do to streamline workload without sacrificing outcomes, I'm all for exploring those sorts of, efficiencies. So this seems especially relevant. This is saying that as a teacher, potentially, we're assuming the Pareto principle applies within this domain of teaching. Maybe it doesn't. Okay, but let's run with it. It appeared in this session on leaders for education, so I'm assuming it might apply to this domain as well. So we're assuming that as a teacher, 80% of what you're trying to achieve as a teacher is going to be the result of only 20% of your efforts. Okay, So I think we should take a step back and ask ourselves, what is it that we're aiming for as a teacher? What's the ultimate outcome? And in the broadest sense, the ultimate outcome is learning. And so perhaps we could formulate it like this. We might be able to say that 80% of what students learn in school is the consequence of only 20% of what the teachers do. Maybe. Is that the right way to think about it? I mean, learning is ultimately something the student does. Learning is a product of thinking that happens inside their own heads. So, okay, bear with me. So maybe, let's focus on the student for a second. Maybe 80% of what students learn in school is the result of only 20% of their thinking. Okay, so students are thinking about lots of stuff in lessons, but it's a core of 20% of those thoughts, of those thinking processes that ultimately result in 80% of what is retained and learned. Again, I'm operating on the assumption that this Pareto principle applies in this domain. It's more of a thought experiment. Let's just see where this goes. Okay, so potentially that seems sensible. That seems like it might be the case. Now, then you have to think about the connection between the teacher, what the teacher's doing, and what the students are thinking about. So ultimately, if learning is a product of thinking, then the teacher's job is to get students thinking. And thinking the sorts of thoughts that are going to result in learning. Now, maybe then, only 20% of the teacher's efforts result... Okay, hang on, let me say that again. Right, so maybe 80% of the sorts of thoughts that ultimately result in learning for the student. Okay, so maybe 80% of that thinking is the result of 20% of what the teacher's actually doing when it comes to planning and interactions in the classroom and effort and time spent. So actually we've got a double layered application of the Pareto principle here. 80% of what is ultimately learned is perhaps the result of only 20% of what the student's thinking about, and then perhaps only 80% of that is the result of 20% of what the teacher's actually doing. Oh God, I'm going to have to stop and do some maths now. Right. So let me think. What's 80% of 20? 80% of 20 is 16. Okay, cool. So does that suggest that the maximum impact that a teacher could have on a student's learning is only about 16%? I think so. I've gone down a rabbit hole here. Like I said at the start, I did give you a disclaimer. I said these thoughts weren't very well formed, and they might be even messier by the time we got to the end of the podcast. I think I've gone down a rabbit hole. I'm going to try and climb my way out. Right, let's make it, instead of doing a double layer application of this Pareto principle, let's just go back to the idea that I've got myself confused, basically. And now I'm trying to do mental arithmetic, and as my students will tell you, I'm not very good at that, so I'm getting more confused. So let's go back to this idea that 80% of what students learn is the result of 20% of the teacher's efforts. Now, that is a very simplified picture, because what I tried to do a minute ago was consider the fact that actually this relationship between what the teacher does and what the students ultimately learn is mediated in the middle by what students are actually thinking about. So it is a more complicated picture than I'm presenting. But let's go back to the main thrust of the point. This is meant to be about teacher time management. So how does this apply? How does this help us think about time management in a way that could help us streamline our workloads? So if this principle applies and 80% of what students ultimately learn is perhaps the result of only around 20% of teachers' efforts, then what does this mean? Does this mean that we should, first, we should try and figure out which of our efforts it actually is? Find that 20%. We need to figure out which 20% is having that maximum impact. And I guess if we can zoom in on those efforts and enhance them, refine them, then that could be a route to streamlining our workload. And I think this does ring true. So I've been a teacher for 4 years now, and I used to do, when I first became a teacher, I used to do an awful lot. I was very busy all the time, doing all sorts of things, thinking about all sorts of things, preparing all sorts of things. I was just very, very, very busy. Over time, however, through kind of, iterations of trial and error and reflecting on what I do and thinking about the impact, I've gradually done less and less. I've done less and less, but I feel I've achieved more and more. So less effort, but higher impact. And perhaps this is because with experience, I've started to get a better understanding of that 20%. Okay, so the 20% of my efforts that's ultimately resulting in the 80% of the impact that the students actually benefit from. And I guess a question would be, how do we speed up this process? It's taken me several years. Well, I would say reflection is key. You need to try and give yourself time at the end of the day or at the end of the week to sit and think, even if it's only a few minutes, about what went well and what didn't. And just by having those thoughts, you'll gradually find yourself tending towards doing more of what went well and less of what didn't work so well. So you'll get you'll find a natural path towards efficiency. So personal reflection's key. Speaking to more experienced colleagues is key. Colleagues will be able to point out immediately if you're doing something that's a waste of time when it ultimately comes to student learning. One thing I used to do, I used to try and make sure all of the questions and images that I was snipping into my PowerPoint presentations, I used to spend ages trying to make sure they were in the middle of the slide. What a load of nonsense. What a load of wasted time. So yeah, that was completely useless. So make sure we're reflecting on what we're doing so we can get a better idea of what works and what doesn't, what's having the maximal impact, and maintain a close dialogue with more experienced colleagues because they can guide you in these reflections and help you figure out what has maximal impact. Now, my only question is, and I'll end this part of the discussion. I'll end this section on this question. So let's say that according to the Pareto principle, around 80% of student learning is the result of only 20% of what the teacher's actually doing. Okay. Well, what about the other 20% of student learning? Because, ideally, we don't want students to only retain 80% of the curriculum. Obviously that'd be fantastic. But in an ideal world, they're getting it all. They'll have a complete, comprehensive, 100% understanding. So does that mean then that the remaining 80% of the teacher's efforts that would be perhaps required to take the student from an 80% understanding of what's being taught up to a complete, comprehensive 100% understanding, does that mean then that that extra 80% of the teacher's efforts are still necessary, still required? I'm not sure. Conveniently, I'm thinking now of Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction. He says that 80% on a test, on an assessment. So we're assuming here that what a student does how a student performs on an assessment would be an accurate reflection of what they actually know and learn and understand. On that assumption, 80% is actually ideal. Rosenshine says it's enough to allow the student to feel a sense of competence and like they're doing well, but it's not so much that they experience the curriculum as easy and lose motivation or disengage. There's still room to grow. You want to chase that additional 20%, okay, but you have received a good enough score to make you feel capable of actually attaining that additional 20% and getting an even better mark next time. Okay, there you go. I'll leave that there. I'll leave that one there. Okay, now, before I just move on to the second thing, it'll be a shorter discussion, the second one. I hope. We'll see. First, my Patreon plea. So this episode took a couple of hours to produce, and I aim to produce a couple of episodes a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee once a month, so £2 to £3 once a month, then please consider signing up on the Patreon, and you'll be helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution is greatly appreciated, and if you do sign up, you'll also gain exclusive early access to unedited videos of my recording sessions. So if you thought that this final recording that you're listening to on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whatever it might be, was long and meandering and a bit confused, wait until you see the video, unedited video. It's even more painful. Okay, you got that to look forward to if you sign up on the Patreon. Anyway, right, on to the second thing. It was a session at a recent teacher training day, and there were lots of pithy quotes flying around on this teacher training day. And one of them, when discussing inclusion, was that we want inclusion, but not individualism. Inclusion, but not individualism. And I wanted to unpack that a little bit, try to unpack that a little bit. I mean, inclusion is about ensuring that all students, regardless of their personal circumstances, have the same opportunities to learn. That's my understanding anyway. Now, individualism, on the other hand, as far as I'm aware, is kind of like a bit of a political ideology or philosophy where the individual's needs are given priority over the group's needs. It's an idea which I believe is kind of widespread, fairly widespread in the West, and you can contrast this idea with collectivism, another philosophy, ideology, where instead the group's needs are given priority over the individual's, and that sort of way of thinking is more common in some Eastern cultures. I heard something so interesting once. Apparently, because you might ask, well, why in the West do we tend towards individualism, and why in the East do cultures and countries tend towards more collectivist thinking? I heard once that it was to do with the type of farming that early Western and Eastern communities engaged in. So back when we were just kind of moving from being hunter-gatherers into agricultural societies. In the East, lots of rice was grown, and apparently, this could be complete hogwash, but I read it somewhere, and it stuck with me. Apparently, rice is a crop that requires a community to grow. It can't be grown by an individual. So that gave rise to a situation in which the community came first, because if people were going to eat, the community had to work together. Now, apparently, in contrast, in the West, due to different climates and the availability of different resources, Westerners chose to grow wheat, which apparently can be grown by an individual, or there's less of a requirement anyway for a whole community of people in order to cultivate wheat. So in the West, that gave rise to a situation in which the individual was prioritized over the group, because the individual could feed themselves regardless, or largely regardless of whether the community helped them. But not so in the East, where rice was being grown. Anyway, I've gone off on a big old ramble there. I just wanted to highlight the difference between individualism and collectivism. Now, what struck me is that individualism isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different way of living compared to collectivism, or a different way of thinking anyway, perhaps a slightly different value system. Perhaps one of those value systems is better than the other, but that's not for me to decide on this podcast. But there's nothing inherently wrong with individualism. In a world where we need to work together to solve some pretty big global problems, perhaps there are some inherent issues with individualism. But anyway, I'm not going to go any further than that now. But what struck me was that in this training session, they were saying inclusion, not individualism. We want to have inclusive teaching practices, but we don't want that to result in individualism. And that just, it struck me because, like I said, individualism is a widespread philosophy in the West. It has been for many thousands of years. And there's nothing obviously problematic with it. But here in this little pithy quote, inclusion, not individualism, it's being set up as the bad guy, really, isn't it? And so I got thinking about that. And I think the target wasn't really individualism, but rather something that I'd like to call exceptionalism. So, people pursuing individual freedoms isn't necessarily a problem. The problem might be people making exceptions of themselves. So, pursue your own interests, your own freedoms, but there are a set of underlying rules, which, you might call it a social contract, which people must abide by. And if you think that there's something about you which means that those rules don't apply and you deserve special treatment at the cost of the rest of the community, then that's a real issue. That's a real issue. And I could see how certain inclusive practices could perhaps foster in certain students an attitude of exceptionalism. So, for example, if you're trying to get a certain student into lessons, and if you relax the requirement, for example, that they need to have a fully correct uniform before they can enter those lessons, if you relax that requirement just for that individual student, just in order to get them into lessons, then you might have created a condition where that student now has better access to learning, has a better opportunity to learn, but you might at the same time have encouraged that student to think that there's something about them in particular that makes them an exception to the rules that other people have to follow. Exceptionalism, that's the issue. And why is that an issue? Well, ultimately, it's alienating. There's a whole set of tacit, underlying, latent rules and conventions and norms that we all follow when interacting with people all the time, that govern all of our social interactions. And, if we don't follow those rules, our actions are typically labelled as antisocial. And so if you grow up believing that you are an exception to rules, then you might find it difficult to find a social group when you're older. And I'm just talking socially here, but it might be in the professional workplace as well. You might find it difficult to find a group that accepts you. Because if you're someone who thinks that, who's grown up thinking that the rules don't readily apply to you, there's something about you which means that you don't have to follow these certain rules that govern social interactions, then you're going to stick out like a sore thumb. And you might do things that, even if they're not antisocial, they might lack tact, or they might be seen as unusual, and the group might you might end up feeling alienated from the group, or the group might consciously alienate you. And that's a problem. So yeah, I thought I just wanted to clarify in my own mind what the target was with this particular pithy quote. Inclusion, not individualism. I don't think individualism is the issue. I think it's exceptionalism. We need to make sure all students, regardless of their personal circumstances, can access learning and have the same opportunities to learn. But at the same time, that needs to be done in such a way that doesn't lead certain individual students into thinking that they are exceptions to rules. Because if they grow up with that attitude, they will find it difficult to fit in with groups, all of which are ultimately rule governed. If you want to be part of a group, then there are all sorts of expectations and conventions and attitudes that go along with being part of that group. And if you think you're an exception to those, then you won't really be welcome within that group, or you won't feel like you fully belong within that group. And that could be a, path to loneliness, alienation, all sorts of other issues. And that's such a hard balance to find. Like staff who work specifically in inclusion have to try and navigate that tension all the time, and I don't envy them. It must be a really, really hard job, yet such an important one. So, you have my admiration. You really do. That's it. I've been talking for way too long today. I hope you might have enjoyed some of these rambly thoughts. If you have any thoughts of your own in response to any of my thoughts, then please do let me know. Reach out to me however you like. There's loads of ways to do that. Check out the show notes. And there'll be one more episode before the end of this academic year. And in that episode, I'll give a bit of an update on my situation going into next year. In short, I'm going to be doing a PhD next year. And so I'm going to be teaching part-time. So things will change a little bit. But I'll talk more about it in a next episode. I hope you enjoy your week. And we'll talk again soon. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.